Hey guys, I, like many of you, am a nerd when it comes to world building. I've legitimately seen hours and hours of world building videos for Game of Thrones alone. I mean, come on, lore videos voiced by the official cast? That's like super cool. World building was the first thing that I ever did for my own books too, and I got carried away with it too, and I think I wrote like 300,000 words in around 2 to 3 months. But it's probably the thing that probably excites you all most about your fictions or your favorite stories. But what I wanted to talk about today specifically isn't just the process of world building, even though I know we could geek out over that for hours. What I wanted to address here is how at a certain point, a story can start world building on its own, completely independent of the author. This is the holy grail of world building for fiction writers, and it's what I call the world building event horizon, and I'll show you how to reach it. There are many times in fiction where we will come across something in a story that just doesn't seem to work within the scope of the world building. Like how everyone from all across the world will just speak one language for some reason.
Fine, let's stay a few more days.
Flameo, Hotman!
Flameo?
These moments act as little holes in the world building that we might feel are otherwise well-constructed pieces of fiction. But the opposite can also happen too. A world can be so faithfully, genuinely, and deeply constructed that we interpret these little holes not as mistakes, but as information that we have yet to learn. If things still aren't clear yet, let me give you an example. In Game of Thrones, the Targaryens came across the sea to Westeros and conquered everything with 3 dragons. That all makes sense. But the Targaryens originally came from a place called Valyria, where dozens of other powerful families had dozens of other dragons. Valyria and its dragon tamers were famous for conquering everything in front of them. Now, Westeros existed alongside Valyria for hundreds, if not thousands of years, yet the Valyrians never tried to conquer it, even though we all know they totally could have. So this is where we have our quote-unquote world-building hole. Why would a super militaristic, dragon-wielding nation not try to take a massive, easy target for centuries? Well, the simplest, boring, and probably true answer is that George R. R. Martin likely just didn't think about this. He probably made thousands of years of independent Westerosi history and didn't want to get rid of it just because the Valyrians would have logically conquered the continent. But luckily for George R. R. Martin, he had crossed the world-building event horizon, meaning these little holes in the world started to fill themselves in naturally. Even though none of this information I'm going to say is in the books, it is almost canon amongst the fans that the Valyrians didn't invade out of fear of Westeros' magic. There are theories about the Lannisters' gold being cursed, and the children of the Forest being able to steal away control of the dragons, like how Bran and the other Starks can control wolves, or that Westeros as a whole was doomed, to just fall inevitably, so the Valyrians stayed away. Honestly, that one might have been true, but do you see how incredible what I'm saying is? Even though this small aspect of George R. R. Martin's world building isn't technically logical, the rest of his world is so detailed that fans believe there has to be a reasonable explanation. And in lieu of being given an explanation by the creator, fans will just create more complex world building on their own to make it make sense. This is the Holy Grail. This is the world-building event horizon. It's a space where once you pass a certain level of detail in your world building, it can no longer be perceived as illogical or inconsistent. In the same way that people view mysteries in the real world as having some underlying answer, they will do the same to your world, whether you as a writer intended it or not. Passing the world-building event horizon means that your setting becomes a living, breathing, evolving space that cannot contradict itself in the eyes of its beholders. But how do you get to a spot like this? Is it even achievable for the average writer? Well, you're in luck, because this isn't a matter of skill, it's a matter of understanding and dedication. But before we get into the 2 pivotal aspects to understand about world building, I am genuinely ultra excited to talk about today's sponsor, the book. It's literally called the book. I hope you guys can see this because like this is kind of crazy. So this is like a huge coffee table book. I really hope it's in frame. It's really, really cool. So this company reached out to me and they were like, hey, your name is Savage Books. You talk about books. Why don't you talk about our book? And I was like, you know what? This is a really cool book. So I'll talk about it. And the reason I specifically wanted to talk about it today, aside from it just being beautiful, like it's a massive, gorgeous coffee table book, is that it specifically pertains to world building. This stuff is like 400 pages of non-stop inventions about humankind and the history of our civilization. And it's like chock full of like insane art pieces as well. Here, let me show you. It's just, the whole thing is just so massive and there's so much content that it's literally almost hard for me to show this. So like, for example, here we have an entire section just on livestock. Like just this page is beautifully illustrated just to be able to show you different aspects, different facts, and the logic behind how certain things were made. If you want to do more like some more like technological stuff, they have stuff on like submarines as well. Again, beautifully illustrated. I really can't get over how high quality this book is. For some last little details, it has 180 topics, 23 chapters, and has used 50 professional artists to make the amazing art inside. So again, link down below, grab your copy. It's really, really well done, and I'm very excited to be able to share this with you all because I am writing or actually just got finished with a 900 something page book, and I really wish I had something like this during that time. Check out the link below in the description if you want to get your own. I'd highly recommend it because it's just really cool. So this could be your world building tool. But now that that's finished, we can go back to being knee deep in talking and nerding out about world building nonsense. So let's break down the two concepts that are most pivotal: suspension of disbelief and consistency. Suspension of disbelief is the silent agreement that creators and consumers come into when creating and consuming art. It's the thought that even though some details in stories don't really make sense, I will suspend my disbelief of them in order to enjoy the rest of the fiction as a whole. It's about choosing to enjoy what a writer meant to do versus being critical over what they actually did. A really famous example of this is having a hostage being duct taped at the mouth. In most stories, they can't talk or scream or pretty much do anything. We've probably seen it like a dozen times, right? But in reality, duct taping someone's mouth doesn't do anything, like at all.
Come on! Can you just please be quiet? Sure.
But with suspension of disbelief, we know the hostage is supposed to be gagged and silent, so we just accept it. Suspension of disbelief is important for world building as well. It's just easier for us to enjoy the fiction if we are not critical. But even in world building, suspension of disbelief can only go so far. The most famous recent example of this is actually in Star Wars. As phenomenal as this scene might have been, it completely spits in the face of the entire history of the Star Wars universe. Does the fiction really just want me to believe that in the hundreds of years of space warfare, no one has ever used a hyperdrive as a weapon? It's basically like better than a Death Star, right? And a heck of a lot cheaper. Issues like this become too big to ignore and end up negatively impacting our interaction with the fiction. This is where we get into our second important topic: consistency. In considerations of fictional logic, there are two types of consistencies: external consistency and internal consistency. External consistency is how well things in the fiction relate to the real world. To reference back, a single piece of duct tape on the mouth would have low external consistency because that's not how real world duct tape works. But this use of duct tape from the Batman would have high external consistency because this would keep someone quiet in the real world. However, the much more important consistency is the second one: internal consistency. Internal consistency is how well the fiction's world follows its own rules and relates to itself. Some fictions have purposefully low internal consistency, like Harry Potter, where magic can kind of just do whatever at certain times. Other fictions seem to accidentally have internal consistency problems by contradicting themselves, like how Ant-Man can punch people with the weight of a full man, but can also run on a gun as if he was super light, or how when he gets big, his weight increases somehow to match his size. The beauty of writing and world building, though, is that low internal consistency like this is counteracted by our suspension of disbelief. They work hand in hand. Sure, not everything makes sense, but we enjoy the fiction anyway because we choose not to be critical. Now, of course, some fictions really skirt the line with suspension of disbelief, like the Fast and Furious franchise, but that's almost like their calling card at this point.
Thing about street fights, the street always wins.
However, there are a few fictions that understand the key to high-level world building and eventually crossing that event horizon. These fictions know that first and foremost, world building should always be used to further the immediate events of the narrative. If your world building isn't helping me gain context or appreciate the journey of the characters, please don't exposit all over my face.
In Adlin's time, 7 kingdoms were one. Our ancestors gathered here. Atlantis sat here at the head of the table.
I don't care about the economic stratification of the colonial ward in your Astro settlements. In fact, we only care about a world insofar as we care about the characters in that world. Your setting, your world building, should be tailor-made to foster the growth of your characters. Lord of the Rings had a huge world, but it all catered to an investigation of identity, corruption, and camaraderie. Avatar has a huge world, but it all catered to duty, spiritualism, and nature. Game of Thrones had a huge world, but it was all created to explore greed and power and anti-war and screaming about climate change to people who won't listen to you. First and foremost, you are telling a story. The world you make is simply a tool to tell that story better. Then, after you've put in the work to really think about how your characters interact with your world, you reach a spot where the world itself becomes a character. Westeros and Middle-earth and all the Bending Nations become just as cool to learn about as characters because of what has happened in them and what they represent. Once you put in the hours and hours of work that it takes to show people your world, rather than shoving it down their throats, they will see your world as a character. And that means they will see the flaws in your world not as mistakes, but as nuances and intricacies and character flaws, just as they would for any other human. Crossing the world building event horizon and creating a world that then creates itself is all about showing your readers and your viewers that the world is to be trusted, that your gods and cultures and regions have a reason to be and a truth behind them. Because now, more than ever, people are yearning for another world to escape to. So why not have it be yours? Anyway, thanks for watching all the way until the end. If you like what you heard, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And also make sure to check out our sponsor, The Book. It's really, really cool, and I think it could help world building a lot. As always, it was a pleasure, and I'll talk to you all again soon.